Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her.
And I'm Caitlin, and my pronouns are she, her, he, him, and they, them.
Today, we'll continue our Jesus Loafs You series with today's Breadpocalypse episode. In this episode, we'll discuss the 11th Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Lectionary 19 or Proper 14, which this year falls on August 8th. And we do have one content note for you. We will be talking about eating disorders a lot in this episode, especially during the deep dive.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
So today, for our deep dive, our guest is Caitlin Reilley Beck, who is nerdy about many things, including math, Minecraft, music, and theology. She collects worshiping communities, and he is also a camp director for Queerest and Dearest, an intergenerational Christian camp for queer and trans folks. Caitlin lives with an eating disorder, their partner, 2 housemates, and 5 cats.
Welcome.
Thank you.
We are so glad to have you with us.
I'm very excited to be here.
So, Caitlin, we are in the middle of our Jesus Loafs You series, in which we talk a lot about food. This episode is titled Breadpocalypse, which is fun, but also gets at the ways that food is complicated for a lot of people and can even feel catastrophic or apocalyptic. So we wanted to talk about those complications, and for this episode especially, eating disorders. Can you tell us a bit about what makes something an eating disorder?
An eating disorder there's a range of them, and it's basically disordered behavior, which means things that you do that sort of get in the way of the body's normal functioning in terms of knowing what it needs to eat and acting on that knowledge. So, you feel hungry, or you have even like a particular desire for a kind of food, and you seek out that food and then you eat it, and your body processes it in that kind of way. And so for an eating disorder, it's sort of a psychological, which is not to say that it doesn't have brain components or whatever, or like physical brain components, sort of barrier that interrupts that process. And so it can be a number of different sort of reasons and rationales behind that, and ways in which that process is interrupted. But those are basically what eating disorders are.
I think there are a couple of more common eating disorders that people have heard of, and there's like disordered eating.
Yeah.
Right.
So, a lot of it is relative. So something sort of crosses into an eating disorder when it's getting in the way of your life enough and you notice it to warrant taking action, really, or it's like stopping you from living the life you want to live.
Right.
And I like the medical community has more specific guidelines for what counts as an eating disorder and what doesn't, and what's sort of just disordered eating. But disordered eating itself is, a real comes before you get an eating disorder, right? So those are warning signs, and those are also things that warrant changing your behavior and your actions. So, and yeah, like the commonly known eating disorders, most commonly known, are anorexia and bulimia. And in addition to that, there are eating disorders that are like orthorexia, and eating disorder not otherwise specified is also one.
And orthorexia, just because that's
orthorexia is basically you think there's like a very clear and rigid sense of like what you can and are allowed to eat. And so it might not involve the same kinds of like quantity limiting, but it would be like, for example, like a really strict, diet where you only ate like certain vegetables would be a form of orthorexia.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I know some people have talked about like exercise as part of eating disorders. Would that be in the like anorexia?
It can. It can be part of it in any eating disorder, basically. Any behavior you do that sort of is meant to like counteract your body's process of like needing food and getting the like nourishment from that food, right? So some people will do exercise as the way that they're like interrupting that process, right? Basically being, oh, I feel like I'm feeling hungry and I need food, but it's bad to eat or whatever. So I'm going to do exercise to counteract the food that I've eaten or whatever. Yeah.
Caitlin, would you be willing to tell us something about how you came to learn so much about eating disorders?
Yeah, sure. So I was diagnosed with an eating disorder, I would say like 5 or 6 years ago. But it's something that I have been dealing with, or certainly disordered eating is something that I've been dealing with since I was a pretty young child, sort of like 9 or 10. And I mean, one of the main reasons that I never sought a diagnosis for an eating disorder before that, or treatment or anything like that, is that, I was a fat kid and I'm a fat adult. And basically, fat people are encouraged to have eating disorders as a part of, the anti-fat world and society that we live in at present. And so, when I was like 9 or 10 and I was being bullied for being fat, like, rather than counteract that bullying with like, maybe people shouldn't bully you. Here's some help and support in the school environment for you. And you're still a great kid, Caitlin, or whatever. That could be a way you deal with bullying. Instead, they were like, oh,
Sure.
You're being bullied for being fat. Well, here's how you could not be fat.
At the age of 9 and 10.
Age of 9 and 10, yeah.
Kids are usually a little overweight because they're about to have 18 different growth spurts in the next 6 years.
Totally, yeah.
Right. When there's a meme that recently went around that's like, the problematic part of fat shaming is the shaming.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Not the
That's
fat.
right. That's
Yes.
exactly it.
And that seems like what you're saying.
I think the thing for me also is like, I also really thought when I was that age, okay, I think I'm fat. I think I'm a fat kid. But like, it's important for me as a fat person now, as an adult, that like fatness has a real, like there are real quantitative ways of measuring fatness, and it's not just about whether you sort of feel fat, right? Because that's an experience that people have at a variety of sizes. But like anti-fatness shows up in ways that affect people of different physical sizes differently. And when I was a kid, to be honest, I was not a fat kid. I was like finding clothes at all the stores that I need to get clothes from. And like, I just was like not a skinny kid. And
Sure.
I like thought I was fat, and, the world picks up on that kind of thing. And that was enough to sort of push me into disordered eating patterns. And like, it's not enough for everybody to develop an eating disorder. So like, as much as like bullying was part of that history for me, there are lots of other factors that were also part of it. And not everybody who has that experience develops either disordered eating patterns or an eating disorder, so that's also true.
I think I've also heard it be connected with like when someone's, especially for kids, when their life feels out of control, and when there's a lot of stuff going on that they can't control, then disordered eating and eventually eating disorders can become like the one thing they can control.
Yeah.
Which then is problematic because then it starts to control them, right? Like, so it's ultimately it's not going to be the thing you can control, and ultimately we can't control really anything, but that's part of
it's. I mean, ultimately it is a coping and survival mechanism and strategy, right? And like throughout my recovery process, it's been a really important piece of work for me to do to actually like, because I think my initial internal reaction is to be like, oh, like I was stupid or wrong or bad for developing an eating disorder. But actually, like, it was a survival strategy that I developed in order to get through things that were really hard in my life that I might not have been able to manage otherwise. And so that's really, like, that's a thing worth honoring, even if it's not a thing worth continuing.
When you talked about the different ways that people could have approached how you were being bullied, and yet they did not. I've also heard of a movement that is trying to address that in a way called the Health at Every Size movement, where the idea is that maybe being healthy isn't a matter of being attractive or being someone else's ideal. Maybe being healthy has more to do with a lot of other measurements other than your weight. And people who are fat can be healthier than people who are not, and people who are not fat can be really, really unhealthy in so many different ways.
Yeah, so the Health at Every Size movement, I think, particularly within eating disorders treatment, is a radical shift, because the other reality, one of the reasons that fat people don't get diagnosed with eating disorders is because there is this sense that okay, it's not good if you're too thin, right? Those are the people who we think maybe have eating disorders. But if you're too fat, that's equally not good, right? We're just trying to get everybody into this very middle ideal box. But the medical data doesn't support that as a model for how human bodies exist and what they need to live. That's actually there isn't this narrow range of weight or body size or shape that defines how a human being can live a good life, a healthy life. And the other thing I would say is that, one thing that's really important as a part of the sort of fat liberation movement is that health itself isn't required for a person to live a life that they want to live.
Yes.
Or, live what they consider to be a good life. I think it's important for me. I have a lot of privilege around ability. And so, I think it's important from a disability justice perspective to name that you don't have to be healthy in order for your life to be important and valuable. But it is also true that you do not have to be thin to be healthy. And I think that is also an important piece of information that most people don't have.
Yeah. I have occasionally phrased it as health is not a moral virtue.
That's right.
Having it doesn't make you better than someone else.
That's right. Yeah.
And I was the kid at the other end of the spectrum when it came to that sort of thing, severely underweight until at my early 20s when my metabolism finally calmed down a little bit. It turns out that being asked every 2 weeks if you're anorexic is a little, mind-bending on its own.
Totally.
So that was...
Yeah, I think that's definitely a reality too, that a lot of people have this connection in their mind between thin bodies and eating disorders, and my experience as a fat person is that is not an accurate reality. I don't know any fat people who haven't struggled with disordered eating or eating disorders. It's such a pervasive reality, and part of that is because society, including the medical establishment, encourages fat people to have eating disorders and says that it's for their health. And it's causing a lot of real harm to fat people. So that is not good.
Yeah. I know I work part-time as a chaplain at our local hospitals, and I know when I chart, when I'm charting on patients, right, there's a column on the left that has basic information. And so it has name, birthday. They actually just, miracle of all miracles, after way too long of pushing for this, have a space where you can voluntarily add sexual orientation, gender identity, sex assigned at birth, because sex assigned at birth does frequently impact medical care. And always it has BMI, body mass index, which is has been debunked so many times, but it still shows up both as just a fact of the person, and then if it's over a certain amount, there's an exclamation point or whatever the case may be.
Wow.
Yeah. That's a depressing reality for sure, but is definitely a feature of any fat person's interaction with any part of the medical system is like they can't help but see you as a fat person before anything else. And I like actually shouldn't say fat person because they just see you as fat. Your like actual personhood doesn't usually figure very prominently in how they treat you, whether that's like how they treat you personally or medically. And that's really, really terrible.
Yeah. I mean, I've
and
heard
gets
about...
people killed.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. Right, like the joke that I have heard is you go in for a broken ankle and they tell you need to lose weight.
Yeah, that's right.
It's like literally broken ankle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like if you want the most reliable, treatment and medical information about a condition as a fat person, just like get a thin person to go in and say they have the same symptoms, and then you can find the actual information that they would tell you. Yeah.
Yeah, I know a number of people who didn't start getting decent medical care until they started bringing someone else with them on their medical appointments to act as an advocate. Mm-hmm. And that's just depressing.
That's right. And I mean, it's obviously, as is the case, like there are lots of other ways in which that, like, a person's like status as fat intersects with their other identity pieces. Like I have a lot of privilege as a white person, and I also have learned a lot about how to advocate for myself in a medical setting, partly because both of my parents are doctors. And so I would say it's not an intimidating scenario for me, but it definitely is. It's sort of more like I have learned the techniques that are needed in order to like advocate for the treatment that I need in most cases. But like lots of people just don't have that background, that experience, and so it's a lot more difficult to get that.
Right. The like having a salad clearly visible for the virtual meeting with your doctor while discussing whatever the thing.
Or one of my favorite tricks that I learned fairly recently is if the doctor wants to refuse to test you for something, make sure that they put the refusal of the test on the chart. And if they refuse to put the refusal on the chart, then ask them why. And then they will usually agree to the test.
That's right. Yeah.
There are so many forces in our society that work against people's health while claiming to work for people's health. And one of those forces I can't help thinking about is what I've recently come to call the diet industrial complex. Thank you to Jamila Jamal on Twitter, who has done a lovely job over the past few years ripping them to shreds. And it's amazing how many people this whole industrial complex manages to hurt while also claiming to be working for their health.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really...
That just terrifies me.
That's really true. And like, yeah, Jamila does a great job, particularly as a very like mainstream popular celebrity, of sort of pointing towards the ways in which the like diet industrial complex is like constructing lies to control people and to make money. I think that's one of the things that she's best at. And I think, she's also made some significant missteps.
Oh yeah.
And of course, like, she's learning from and standing on the shoulders of, and to some degree acknowledges that, like, so many other like fat activists that are also doing this work. That I think is worth saying. But yeah, I mean, I think she does it in a like pithy, concise, and direct way that I think is important for people in the world to hear. And I think it's also true that they're more likely to hear it from a celebrity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a book that I really love that in many ways like really takes this on, and it's called Dietland.
Oh, I haven't actually heard of that one.
I love it. It's a fiction novel, but it takes on, so it's Dietland by, I want to say Sarai Walker, so I'm not positive how to pronounce the author's first name, but
that sort of reminds me of a couple of pieces I wanted to make sure to talk about, which, so we talked about the Health at Every Size movement and the sort of, original theory textbook is by Lindo Bacon, and they're a very cool person, and they have a new book out, which I should preface maybe talking about books with the fact that I don't actually read very many books. So most of these books I have not read, but I have like talked to people who are influenced by them, and I've learned about them. And Lindo Bacon's new book is called Radical Belonging, and is like really expanding this to sort of a wider justice lens, which I think is really important. And like, I can't remember exactly. Lindo Bacon is non-binary in some capacity. I can't remember more specific content about their gender, but I think it's worth also noting the connection between like trans experience and eating disorders, because it's really, really, really common and like is definitely true for me. So, and I would say the other piece is like our society has this sort of lens about eating disorders or perspective about eating disorders, right? But that's like these like thin white women, right? So we sort of talked about how lots of fat people have eating disorders, but like lots of people who are not women and lots of people who are not white also have eating disorders and are not getting treatment sometimes at all, but also the treatment is like designed around these like thin white women. And most of the people who are in eating disorder treatment, like as staff, you know, are white women. And that has a real impact on how treatment programs can be accessed by different people. So like, you know, there's a really high level of especially like exercise-based eating disorders in gay male communities, but also in communities of trans men that are like really underdiagnosed and underserved by the programs that are in place. Because one of the things that isn't explored, I think, like one of the sort of difference between or connection between being dissatisfied with your body because of your like weight and how society treats you because of your weight and having an eating disorder and the experience of gender dysphoria. Like they're not easily distinguishable feelings, or they haven't been for me anyway. And there's a sort of dark joke in like trans male communities that's sort of like, you know, oh, like you're a trans man, what eating disorder do you have? You know, because it is a really common phenomenon, and I think something that like is a really sort of common dual experience, but the treatment programs aren't set up well to sort of support people in that.
Yeah, and I think especially like in the space that you were talking about like whiteness and the way that whiteness and white supremacy work. I mean, throughout medical and science, we know that Black people, especially Black women, and more largely BIPOC, Black Indigenous people of color, are historically and still today treated terribly. Like right now, as we're recording, they're getting ready for the Olympics, and Black women are not allowed to participate because their natural hormone levels fall outside of what the Olympic Committee has deemed appropriate, or because they smoked pot while not competing, or like the reasons that they are using to or they're not counting Simone Biles' extraordinary skills and talents as worth extra points because they're scared about like white girls trying to do it and hurting themselves, right? Like, but the ways that it limits and says like Black women's natural skills and talents and gifts and the work that they have put into cultivating that doesn't like makes it so that they cannot compete because it wouldn't be fair for the white people.
That's right.
And it's just like...
Meanwhile, nobody threw Michael Phelps out of the Olympics for producing half the amount of lactic acid as everybody else.
A book that's sort of connected to this that's, again, worth mentioning is Fearing the Black Body by Sabrina Strings, I think. I'm not sure what pronouns they use.
And we'll, just for our listeners, we'll try and get links to all of these books that we're talking about.
That is fantastic. And again, this is not a book that I've read. I've read, like, excerpts from it, and I have it's like one of the premier sort of texts on fat liberation, and really draws the connection between anti-fat bias and anti-blackness in a way that's really, really important, and can't be, overstated, I don't think. Yeah, it's really an important read and does connect to these particular kinds of things, right? It's like the ways in which Black women's bodies are subject to scrutiny and mistreatment and harm is like the seed of where fat people's bodies are treated the same way.
So, speaking of people and organizations that are terrible.
Ooh, great.
When it comes to anti-fatness, the church, especially in Lent, is really bad at eating disorders. And I think usually Eating Disorder Awareness Week frequently falls somewhere around Lent.
That's right.
And the church is bad at diet culture in general. But that's not actually biblical or faithful, is it?
No. I mean, like everything is through a particular interpretive lens. So through my interpretive lens, I don't think that the kinds of spiritual practice that, are helpful for, refocusing us and connecting us with God, which is sort of how fasting and Lent what the sort of purpose and origin is, that those are meant to be eating disorders, or meant to, like, they have different purposes and functions. And so if the spiritual practice you're doing is essentially picking up an eating disorder or exacerbating an existing eating disorder, or like can't be done by somebody with an eating disorder because of the harm they will face, then like that's not doing a good job, and doesn't track for me with the purpose of those particular kinds of like more ascetic spiritual practices. Like, the spiritual practices are not magical things that have the same effect on every single person's body, right? So, yeah. And like fasting as a spiritual practice has a lot of strong, important tradition around it, both, within Christianity and in other faith traditions. And I think it's also true right now within diet culture, or within a society that is, full of diet culture. It's like really, really difficult to do fasting in a way that isn't caught up in diet culture. And so that makes it inaccessible for people with eating disorders, or makes it dangerous for people with eating disorders, is maybe more accurate. Yeah.
I know in the last several years, I have done more along the lines of picking up a practice. So I love to do praying in color, which we've talked about before on the podcast. And so I'll pray each day, or like our congregation did a prayer calendar for everybody so that everybody could be praying for the congregation during Lent. And that there are other options.
Oh yeah.
Particularly within Christianity.
And I do think that is more and more encouraged in congregations, which I see to be a really good thing, right? That's really encouraging a diversity of spiritual practices. Many, if not at this point, most of which are like not food related. And I think that can be really, that's a positive thing for people with eating disorders and other kinds of, food access and connection issues as well. Like that's, exactly.
Yeah. And I would also throw out there that if you are part of a tradition that has fasting or something like it as part of your spiritual practices, and you are taking an exemption, my understanding is that generally one of the rules is if you're taking an exemption, you don't have to tell anyone why. Mm-hmm. Like you are in fact often encouraged not to.
I think the other thing for me, like, that is useful for my own spiritual practice has been like Lent as an experience of like yes, it's like I have to be conscious and make a like different choice that like maybe other people in my faith communities don't quite understand or whatever. But it can be a real experience of God's grace that, Lent and its gifts are still available to me, and that it's important to God that my spiritual practice doesn't cause me harm. And that I think is a really powerful spiritual experience, particularly for somebody who is recovering from, an eating disorder, where you have this sort of mentality that causing your self-harm is good for you and something that you should be doing. And so, that's a really positive thing that the faith tradition offers to people in that situation. And I do want to...
That's beautiful, and I hadn't thought of it that way.
I want to say also, there's lots in Christianity and Christian sort of cultures that has been used in ways that harms people with eating disorders, and that aligns with diet culture and that kind of thing. But, I do think churches can be spaces with more body shape and size diversity than a lot of other spaces people find themselves in, and I think that can be a really positive experience, especially if you have leadership that is aware of the, of how eating disorders work, and avoiding diet talk and encouraging body neutrality and body acceptance. I think that can be a really good and powerful experience of community, and has actively been my experience in some communities as well, right?
Yeah. And so just for folks who are unfamiliar with the concept of body neutrality, can you just...
So, I think sort of body acceptance or self-love, right? Those are hard things to get to, especially if you have experiences of your body being radically mistreated by society that then you have internalized and it has led to an eating disorder, for example. And so body neutrality, rather than trying to get you to a place where you actively love your body, is about getting you to a place where you have a peaceful, neutral relationship with your body, right? It exists. It is your way you experience the world. You know how to do the things that you need to do to take care of it, but you don't have to be in love with it. And I think that can be a really freeing sort of goal or place to land when you have a really fraught experience with your body. I think often the idea of body love and acceptance, it just feels really hard, and body neutrality gives you a way to exist and live and be fine. And that's a good place to aim.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. As you've been talking about this, we've kind of dipped our toes in this a couple times, but you work with youth,
I do.
Right? Particularly at Queerest and Dearest, which is intergenerational, but also in general. And so I'm curious kind of what it's been like to talk to youth about eating disorders, particularly in a Christian or a faith context, but also kind of the more broadly, because as you said, Christian communities aren't great at this. And so what are the things that you've found, because eating disorders frequently have their roots, if not their inception, so young, what are the things that you found that are helpful or that are good ways to engage with youth in these sorts of conversations?
Yeah. So I think from my perspective, the ways that we talk about our bodies and the ways that we talk about food and eating are, because they're so everyday, those are the most important kinds of changes or interventions that you can make with people of any age, really, and they're so pervasive. It's everything from, talking about food and bodies in scripture and worship, but also how we plan for collective meals, or how we talk about what foods we like and don't like, and the words that we use to describe our own and other people's bodies. So it's a million little interventions, right? Rather than any, there isn't a program that I do about it, right? which isn't to say that that couldn't happen or be useful. I think it could. But honestly, I think it's more useful to talk to like adults in that kind of sort of specific programmatic way, and the sort of smaller interventions with children and youth are more important, right? So like making sure that we talk about all kinds of food in the ways in which they're like good, and not talk about the ways in which they're bad. So we'll counter critiques. Like when kids are like, oh, that food is bad for you, or like that's junk food. I make sure to bring up like what are the things about it that are good. So it tastes really delicious, or like it reminds me of my family, or it's like gives us a lot of energy, or it looks really neat when you cook it in this way, or did you know that it helps your body do this thing? So I think that kind of information and choice about how we talk about food is really important. And normalizing talking about like being hungry and then eating food, right? Because I think paying attention to your body's cues like that, like that's one of the things that I like actively really had to relearn, and am still relearning as a person with an eating disorder. And so making sure that like snacking is an available option, right? So like I wouldn't have a rule at youth group that's like you can't eat at youth group, or like you can't eat certain foods at youth group, right? Like that has to be a space where people can pay attention to those body cues and follow them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Unless somebody has like a really intense peanut allergy, in which case we would say
for sure. Yeah, that's right.
But yeah.
And yeah, obviously whatever you are doing does have to not cause active harm to the other people around you. But in general, like giving people options and providing them with ways they can do the things they need to do to take care of their bodies, it is an important part of youth group. And I think that like one of my regular community norms is like bodies will be bodies, which for me means like sometimes your body needs to go to the bathroom. So when it needs to go to the bathroom, you are able to take it to the bathroom, and sometimes bodies, this is the one I say for younger kids all the time because they love it. I'm like, sometimes bodies fart, and farts are funny, and sometimes they smell gross, but that is a thing bodies do. And it's important that our bodies be able to do that, because that's how we are like digesting food and processing it. And so, yeah, it's like, we don't make fun of people for having a body, for farting. And the more times I say fart, right, the better the conversation usually goes. And then they talk about farting all the time. It is great. And I think that's the kind of thing that I try to make everyday conversation. And I think the most challenging thing for me is that like parents have a lot of different relationships and experiences with food, and like rules that they're like teaching their kids, or that they have for their kids around food, and that's really tricky.
Yeah.
I like one of the first things I sort of did when I was in eating disorder recovery, which they actually sort of help you figure out, is like, what are the things that you say when people are using like food shaming language or fat shaming language around you, and like what are some of the, like, one of the things that I often say is like, or maybe food has no moral value, like when people are like, oh, I'm so bad, I'm eating this. I'm like, or maybe this is morally neutral. Have you thought about how that could be true? And like, honestly,
maybe you're showing appreciation for the person who made this for you.
That's right.
And
yeah, maybe it's a better idea not for us not to examine each other's food choices. That's another one. Or maybe I didn't ask for your opinion about what I'm eating.
Yeah. Well, and speaking about eating and snacks and so forth, Caitlin, we are asking all of our guests during the Jesus Loafs You series to tell us about a favorite recipe, if you have one. Is there a favorite recipe that you would like to share with us?
It's a great question. I am not a person who cooks a lot, and so my favorite food is bread. So I love bread, and I've learned how to make bread. And I think the bread that I still would be like my not like my favorite one that I make, but like the easiest, most accessible one is a recipe for, you can do it as either beer bread or soda bread, and it's like a quick bread recipe that you don't, have to wait very long for, which, who wants to wait when you're like hungry for bread? You just want to like make it.
Exactly.
And I don't know, I can get on board with waiting when it's in the oven, but like if it's not even in the oven, I'm like, I'm going to be here for days. I need food. So this like beer / soda bread recipe I discovered, and I actually discovered it still when I was like at peak eating disorder. And it's sort of a recipe that's kept me, like, it was something I felt like I could eat then, and it's still something I want to eat now. And so that's also a really nice thing for me. So that is what it is a recipe for.
Nice. For our Patreon subscribers / patrons on Patreon, we're going to have the like list of recipes, to the extent that we're able to compile it, available for folks. So it'd be great if we could have that maybe later. And those of you who are not yet patrons, if you become a patron, even at just our lowest level, you'll be able to have access to.
Yeah, I can definitely get that recipe to you.
And now, as we dive into our readings for this episode, our first reading is 1 Kings 19, verses 4 through 8. Now that Elijah has defeated the prophets of Baal, their queen is angry with him, so he flees. Without supplies, he quickly becomes convinced he will die, but he is fed, napped, and encouraged by an angel of God, and does make it to his destination. So one of the themes in this passage, which I brought up, I think, maybe in our last episode, is the concept of halt. Some people who need caffeine call it chalt, but when you're feeling agitated or that sort of a thing, to ask yourself, are you, if you do the C, caffeinated, but are you hungry, angry, lonely, tired? And in this case, Elijah is both hungry and tired, and probably angry and lonely because he just took on like people who want to hunt him down and kill him.
I don't know if caffeine was a thing in biblical times.
Yeah, I think no, it wasn't. It probably was like naturally, but I think coffee came along maybe a bit later.
Yeah,
but they would have had tea.
Positive.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think about this, and I think about, I've been listening through the book Insurgent, which is part of the Divergent series, and Triss just got back from not dying in Erudite headquarters, and she comes down for breakfast and is handed like eggs, which generally is a food that she likes, and she doesn't feel like eating. Like, she just doesn't have an appetite at that moment, but also knows that like she needs to eat because it is like her body needs that nourishment. And so she takes the food and eats it. And I was thinking about this, especially like as we talked about eating disorders, right? And it's kind of, she knows her body needs it, even if like her emotional sense is not wanting food. But I wonder, I guess like it just struck me that like, I don't know how that resonates with you, Caitlin, in particular, of like, is that disordered eating, or is that like part of the process of recovery, even of like, I'm so used to telling my body no about food or restricting that then when I know I need it, but I don't want it.
Yeah.
And I eat it anyway.
That definitely is part of the recovery process of like doing, because it takes a long time to actually recover your ability to tell if you're hungry or thirsty. And so for a good period of time, often in the recovery process, you're relying on some level of meal plan, and like they're generally, you're encouraged still to have flexibility in that meal plan that does allow you, whenever you do notice your internal hunger cues, mostly like if you notice that you're hungry, to then be able to snack, right? Like it's not supposed to stop you from eating ever, but it's supposed to give you like foods that feel safe and accessible, and might even give you more structure than that, right? Like these are like the things you're going to eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You know that you have the groceries available to do them. This is how you make them. right? Everything, even like the actual knowledge about making food plays into eating disorders as well. So like one of the classes like groups that I did was like an actual cooking group, because a lot of people have sensory related issues around making and eating different kinds of foods. But I think that is part of the process to like be like, you're going to eat this at this time, you're going to eat at least this much of it. And actually just doing it.
And that's I know I notice it a lot. And I have a group of friends, and Caitlin, you've been part of these conversations of like, I need to food and I don't know what to do.
I often use, when I'm having a hard time eating, I often use distraction as a way of like sort of letting my body take over the decision making about food, and occupying my brain. So like I'll watch YouTube videos when I'm eating, and that will help me just like sort of go through the motions until I have food in my body, right? And then I'm like, oh, that was a smart idea, and I have the like positive reinforcement of the experience of being nourished without necessarily some of the things that are trickier for me around like the eating part of it. So
and then Kay and I both looked at the same verse, but which is not hard because there's like 5 verses total, but different parts of it. So in looking at verse 4, we read that Elijah himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. And I just had to ask, like, so what kind of broom tree is it? Is it a racing broom tree? Is it a leisure broom tree? Is it a family broom tree? Is it a cleaning broom tree? What kind of a broom tree?
Yeah. It's a really great question. Also,
and what house would have Elijah been in?
That's right.
Ooh.
Oh.
He definitely strikes me as a Gryffindor.
I know, I was going to say the same thing, but I have such a hard time with Gryffindors.
Stuff and then gets...
I'm like, I think for me, when I like think about Gryffindors and I'm like, oh, I don't like them, what is actually true is I don't like cis men Gryffindors. And so I have to remember that that's not all of Gryffindor. And then I'm like, oh, yeah, no, the rest of them are fine. That's a different issue.
I'm a Gryffindor. Yeah, I'm a Gryffindor, so like part Gryffindor, part Ravenclaw. And so like, but it is the like, when Kay said Elijah is Gryffindor, I was like, yeah, like rush in, be big and bold, and then like and then leave, and then be like, the world's going to end. I'm going to die. And then have God be like, no, you're not.
Yeah, this is exactly what Harry would have done. Mm-hmm. Run off into the desert without a plan. You'll be fine. That's right. Be miserable, but you'll be fine.
It also really has echoes of like the end of the book of Jonah, which is just, I love the book of Jonah. It's like the best story. I very strongly spiritually relate to that story. So, and like, this is the exact kind of advice that I often need, right? Like, I need an angel to come up and be like, to take care of me when I'm having a hard time. That's important.
Yeah, why don't guardian angels do more of that? That seems like a great job for them.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in favor.
But it is like very biblical for like a biblical character to be out in the wilderness and then God's like, here, right? Yep. Like when I think both times that Hagar escaped her situation of slavery, God like came to her, and one of them was like she's the first person biblically to name God, which is awesome. But it is that space of look here, I will, even if it's look, there's the well that you need for the water so you don't die.
That's right. I also think in this reading, these like very practical ways of taking care of people are so gendered and so often work that, women do and have done for a really long time. And I think in a lot of ways, like, it can't be overestimated how much that like care work actually makes a difference for people's lives.
Yeah. Yeah, I've noticed when I run a funeral, I ask people a little extra, have you been eating? Do you need to eat something? Are you okay? And that can be really helpful on the one hand, and on the other hand, it is also totally because my grandmother taught me those behaviors. I am being my grandmother's granddaughter when I do that.
Yeah. But I did that too when I had funerals in a previous congregation. I would specifically say, okay, now you as family need to eat. So how are we going to arrange the like meal after the funeral so that you get priority in order to eat? And a lot of times it still ends up being that they're the last ones to eat.
Also in verse 4, we hear Elijah say, "It is enough now, O Lord. Take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." Okay, that is a terrible bar to clear in order to declare who gets to live, Elijah. No, that is not the rule we're going by. You need a nap and a snack and possibly a Snickers bar because you are cranky.
Yes. Now I'm picturing the like Snickers commercials where you're like...
Exactly. Yes. Sometimes capitalism is not an entirely bad thing. I will totally steal the funny "you need a Snickers" conversation. But now that I have actually seen Frozen 2, which I believe actually is almost entirely thanks to Emily plugging it so many times.
Wow.
Yes.
I can say with some certainty that we cannot all be Princess Elsa and the answer to all of our grandparents' sins. Like, that is not how the universe works.
And Princess Anna, who is actually the one who like
Fixes
makes
things.
the tough decisions.
Yeah. And so being no better than your ancestors doesn't mean you have to die. Like, that is not how that works, Elijah. No. Have a snack.
And a lot of us are like learning from our ancestors and trying to do better, and so might actually be, in fact, better than our ancestors.
Some of us are
Or
even
at
trying
least
to
less
encourage other
horrible.
people to learn from their ancestors, even when they don't want to. But
Hashtag critical race theory.
yay. Our second reading for this episode is from Ephesians chapter 4, verse 25 through chapter 5, verse 2. The author instructs us in how to live, generally that we should try to imitate God in what we do, remembering God's constant and self-sacrificing love for us.
So one of the themes that comes up kind of every other sentence practically in this reading is the power of words. So it's telling the truth, it's repairing conflict that is angry conflict and those sorts of things. And the obvious one is like spells, right? Like spells are powerful words, quite literally. But I remember I have only watched the first half of Practical Magic for River reviews and then had, which is a thing we do where we live Facebook a movie that a friend of mine has never seen. River, who's been on our podcast, a guest of our podcast. But in Practical Magic, there's someone who comes to the sisters and like wants this spell book for her partner and wants her partner to love her more or whatever. And the phrasing she has is like, "Can't live without me." And they like are talking about it beforehand, and then in the casting of the spell she says, "Can't live without me," and she hadn't said that before, and so they're like, be careful what you wish for.
Yeah. The book is really good too.
Oh, there's a book.
Alice
I
Hoffman.
didn't know there was a book. Yeah, we were watching this one because there's a lot of queer coding that we were excited about in it.
Also, I really want that house. Like, I like the movie, but I love that house. In verses 26 and 27 in this reading, we read, "Be angry, but do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. Do not make room for the devil." Basically, I read this as don't let your anger like fester and grow and twist inside of you until somebody involved dies or you commit like a felony without really realizing what you're doing. That's not a good plan. Maybe staying up until all hours arguing won't help in the hopes of not letting the sun go down on your anger. Like, that is not always the ideal way to address it. Sleep might help you address what your actual problems are in the long run. But also, please just address your anger, like acknowledge it and talk about it and talk to the person that you're angry at and then try to fix it. Don't just let it sit there and expect the other person to be telepathic. That does not work. Mm-hmm. At least not in my experience. If people know people who are telepathic, that may require a whole different set of how to deal with anger, I suppose. But even Jesus got angry. Like, there's that whole incident with the money changers in the temple. Just please don't be like a Batman villain who sits on their anger until suddenly they need a hideout and minions and a gimmick to express emotions. That is not a life goal, okay?
Yeah.
Like, if you want minions and a hideout and a gimmick, then, well, as long as you pay your minions properly, I might not necessarily have a problem with that, but that can be a fun thing instead of an angry thing.
Yeah, I was thinking about that, and the best model that I have come to with in relationships I'm in is we're going to talk about it when we're angry, and if we get to a point where we need a break, it's, I need a break, let's check in X amount of time, And then, like, at that check-in point, either we return to the conversation to, like, finish and continue it, or we say, I still need more time, or whatever. But there's the, like, making sure you're not just saying, I need a break, and then it just, like, disappears, and you don't deal with the conflict ever.
Yeah, that's right.
How it worked growing up. Yeah.
I'm interested in this verse 28, that thieves must give up stealing. First of all, that's sad news for me. I was like, I love stealing.
Because you're a rogue?
I mean, I am in D&D, so there is that.
All of my Skyrim characters are just going to be out of work.
That's right. Yeah. It's like, I don't know, I love a good heist, but I don't know. When I look at the second half of the verse, right, or like really the end part, that's so as to have something to share with the needy, it does make me then make the connection that, like, you know, the sort of what makes something stealing is that you're not sharing with people who are in need, right? That it isn't actually about the, like, I don't know, unlawful taking of things, but it's about hoarding and not sharing what you have.
Yeah, I was thinking about that because that was the verse that I connected to too, and it just occurred to me as you were talking, because I was like, obviously this is like not taking into account like people who are living in situations of poverty where they cannot get out of poverty and resort for stealing, and so it's not like in the capitalist sense, but it's in, there's this larger sense of like having enough and like working in order to get enough has this larger purpose of being able to also share with other people, which feels very abnegation-y in the Divergent series. But I also, in a contemporary example, we have a few, just a fair few, I think they're like a handful of people who are currently thieves, right? In a capitalist society, all of the people who are currently racing to outer space are thieves. And I have said this before on our podcast, but I am a fan of outer space. I'm a fan of like exploring space. I love outer space. And I think we should tax the people who are currently racing to outer space.
Except NASA.
Because they're a government organization, so I don't know how you tax the government. But like to actually like tax them, because what they are doing is what you're saying, Caitlin, right? Like they are thieves. They are taking from people and not sharing with the needy, and not like they are making people who work for them the needy.
Yeah.
By not paying them fair wages, by not providing benefits, by literally like Walmart employees being handed stuff to sign up for food stamps. Like that is not how it is supposed to work.
Mm-hmm. Don't privatize outer space.
Yeah. The also,
and I love that reframing.
That reference to like work honestly with their own hands, right? That the stealing they're doing is like taking from work that other people have done and then not sharing it. That's actually what the sort of piece of it that's stealing. And it's not the same as when like people need to be taken care of, right? Like thieves are not people who are provided for by the community because they need to be taken care of. They're people who are like not sharing work that they've exploited from other people.
Our gospel reading for this episode is John chapter 6, verse 35 and verses 41 through 51. Jesus explains further that as the bread of life, it is through him that all people come to God, and that he will give up his flesh for the life of the world. So one of the themes in this passage is the assumptions that happen about who we know. And so thinking about, right, these Judeans who are like, we know this kid. He grew up with us. Like, how is he this other thing? And it made me think about what I have learned from people who are in like Codependence Anonymous and other sorts of things. And I imagine also resonates with folks in recovery from eating disorders, that like when you make a big shift, and so it's for Codependence Anonymous or CODA, it's setting boundaries and holding to those boundaries instead of over-functioning or under-functioning or whatever. Or like when you're making a shift about how you approach food, how you talk about food, how you engage with food, it's just like, who is this person?
Mm-hmm.
how? Like, how are you the person that I thought I knew? And it's like, well, I'm trying to be in a healthier space for myself.
Yeah, I think for me, like, one of the things that's hard for me is, like, looking back on the earlier years that I was doing children's and youth ministry when I was, like, peak eating disorder, and how much I ended up, like, projecting my disordered, like, ideas about food and health into those spaces. Mm-hmm. And I think, like, how much that was, like, well received and encouraged by sort of our culture and society. Whereas now I'm having to do a much more countercultural piece of work than I was before. So yeah, it's a real, it's a difficult experience and line to hold when you're trying to do something that's, like, better for you and it's received as worse.
Mm-hmm. And it is, like, I think there's a space, particularly with what you're talking about, of, like, looking back on, like, things that we have done, where there's a, like, and I think this has been maybe a Facebook meme, but, like, acknowledging that a lot of the, like, trauma response and trauma things, like trauma triggers and stuff, not the trauma triggers, but the trauma responses are from times when that was necessary for survival. Mm-hmm. And so we, as humans, develop patterns that help keep us alive. And if my past is very traumatic and I have trauma in my past, I had to develop coping skills that now, as someone who's not in those situations of trauma, are not helpful coping mechanisms, but they were then. Mm-hmm. And so, like, having that space and that grace for myself to say, that is what I needed to survive that time, and it no longer serves now, so how do I shift to a different coping mechanism or a different way of being that serves my purposes now? Yeah. I also was thinking about this, and I'm reading a fairly new young adult book called Dear Martin, which is about this kid who is writing letters. He has this project that he's doing for school of writing letters to Martin Luther King Jr. and, like, reading his writings and that sort of a thing. And it's been interesting having taken a class in seminary called The Theology of Martin Luther King Jr. It's interesting to look at the kid's writings and what he says to MLK and, like, the assumptions that he has made about, like, what Dr. King was talking about or what the perspective is that doesn't actually serve, like, his well-being and wholeness in the larger narrative of the story, but is an assumption. And then he, like, gets more information and, like, understands it in a new way. And so that's in a way that, like, he's able to shift with, versus the Judeans who saw Jesus grow up, who are just like, no, I can't, nope, does not compute. But I really like the book so far. I think it's a great exploration of complicated things, complicated realities.
Cool.
Yeah.
And then as we dive into the verses, in verse 44, we read, in verse 44, Jesus says, "No one can come to me unless drawn by the Father who sent me." And I can't get out of my head all of the TikToks of people drawing and, like, thinking about God drawing people. And then, like, you do on the TikToks, it's like drawing and you see the sketches, but you don't see, like, the final thing. And then it's like a boom, the final thing. And it's like, oh, it's like, how did you get from the A thing to the B thing? Mm-hmm. So God is, like, the drawer, which is not the actual use of that word, but
God is an artist.
Yeah. I mean, in creation, when God creates humanity in God's image, the only image we have for God is creator.
Yeah.
And creative. So
maybe God doesn't draw us. Maybe God spins us on a giant people wheel instead of a pottery wheel.
A Ferris wheel? A merry-go-round?
Oh my gosh, those merry-go-rounds that we had as kids were, like,
oh man, yeah,
off of it.
You're just, like, hanging on to the bars and your legs are, like, flapping in the breeze behind. Yeah.
So fun.
The number of times I got told that children totally die on those things.
Yeah.
I would not be surprised if that happened.
I think it probably does, but maybe not quite as often as my parents like to imply. So
I was gonna say, I haven't seen those in like newer playgrounds, so I feel like it probably happened a fair amount, or, like, enough to not want to make those.
But, like, newer playgrounds are also just entirely made out of plastic. Like, there's no metal or wood or anything, and I don't. Anyway, that seems a little.
Unless they're adventure playgrounds, those are very cool. That are, like, designed to be, like, riskier. It's very cool.
Oh.
I recommend The History of Adventure Playgrounds.
And then finally, in verse 49, we read, "Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, and they died." Well, thanks, Jesus. Aren't you just a little ray of sunshine? This is one of those things where you have to sort of stick with him for a minute, and it gets better, but he has to go to the sad place before he can get there. And so now I am imagining Jesus as Captain Holt from Brooklyn Nine-Nine, who is a character who has this lovely, deep, ponderous voice. But the thing about having a voice like that is that it is always so very easy for us to take much of what he says to sound like he's being horribly depressing all the time because of his voice. But it's only when you really listen to him that you find out that he as a person has a lot of hope and actual joy to him. It's hard for that to come across because of the way that his voice sounds. So sometimes you have to pay a little closer attention to discover that there's a little joy there too.
He is also someone who has an interesting relationship with food as a character. Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
Who, like, one of my favorite moments is when he is describing his, like, ideal food situation, which is that, like, there'd be, like, bricks of flavorless, like, colorless things that would give you all the nutrients you require. And, like, I can understand that from an eating disorders perspective, that, like, if you could just sort of get it over with and there wasn't a lot of, like, trouble or thinking or, like, emotional baggage around it, that's like a real desire, right? And that makes me think of the thing Jesus says at the very beginning, right, would have been really appealing to me, that you will never be hungry and you will never be thirsty, that, like, you will sort of just be taken care of and you don't have to worry about those daily pieces of, you know, care work that you need to do to live. Yeah. And, like, so often in our household, like, my partner and I will just be like, ugh, we have to have food again? I feel like we just had food. Like, why do we have to constantly have food? It's just, like, so frequent that happens. And, like, I don't like to think too much about the fact that I am going to have to keep feeding myself the whole time I'm alive, or I'm not going to be alive anymore. Like, that's a lot of work. That's a huge commitment, you know, and I think that that's an interesting way of thinking about our lives and our bodies, right? That they are this, like, constant, big, like, time commitment, and how reassuring it could be to feel like you're really just secure and taken care of in those daily needs. And that it's that kind of reliability and care that Jesus is offering by saying, I am the bread of life.
And that's a great argument for a universal basic income, right? It doesn't take care of all of those pieces. Like, there's still the, like, practical sense of, like, having to provide the food. But when you're not constantly trying to work or find work for enough money to then, like, do all the work and then also make all the food and then also clean all the house,
yes,
like,
definitely
all of those different spaces, but to, like, have, and we have enough resources to provide everyone with a universal basic income, right? But to have that taken care of, and then it is less of, like, it's not all of those pieces, it's fewer pieces, but still taken care of.
Yeah, and I think, like, I was talking about this yesterday sometime this week with somebody who has lived in the US much more than they've lived in Canada. And, like, one of the sort of differences that comes from the way healthcare is set up in Canada versus healthcare is set up in the US, like, I sort of can't overestimate just the difference in mindset about how much you have to personally be the one to worry about your own survival, to the extent of, like, worrying about every aspect of it when you don't have the sense that healthcare will be available to you when you need it. And I think that's, like, and obviously, like, there's still healthcare inequality and problems with our healthcare system in Canada, and it's not perfect. And I still think it has such a profound impact on your mindset about all of life, you know, that there is something that's going to catch you when you're falling. And it doesn't seem to me that there is anything like that in the US, and that is terrible and scary, and is going to make a huge difference to people's real experience of life. Totally.
Yeah, going back to that whole self-care is a lot of work thing. I spent a fair amount of my time either with people who are living in assisted living or with people who are currently trying to convince a family member that they need to go into assisted living. And I understand the joys of being independent and living in your own home, but also, like, if you're trying to sell me on the thought of going somewhere where I can live there and someone else will clean for me and someone else will make meals available to me, but I can still make my own snacks if I want, and someone else will freaking do my laundry for me, like, you're not going to have to talk me into that. No, that is not going to be a hard sell. Yes, please. Thank you. Sign me up.
Yeah.
And I understand the joys of being independent, but not that much.
That's right. It's like my favorite thing to do, like, as a vacation is to, like, be in a retreat center, right? Because, like, all of your meals are made for you, and you don't have to make any decisions about them. And, like, that is so relaxing to me as a person who has so much stress around food. Like, it's a significant improvement in quality of life for me.
Yeah.
So, Caitlin, any other thoughts on life, the universe, and everything?
I don't really have anything I want to add here, except to say that I really appreciate the opportunity to come and be nerdy about these particular things in the context of a podcast. And so I'm grateful for the work that you both put into this. And I'm really grateful to the people who support this podcast in all the different ways that is available, whether that's patrons or whether that's people who are listening or telling their friends about it. I think it's really a valuable opportunity. So my additional thought is thank you.
Aww.
That's wonderful. We
And
are
thank
also
you,
grateful.
You're very welcome.
Absolutely.
We're grateful for you being on this and for all of our patrons and those who support us in many ways that they can. Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the 12th Sunday after Pentecost with our special guests Liz Williams-Webb and John Webb. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Rohloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at NERDSATCHURCH, Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our full guest episodes and interviews, support us on Patreon.
And our recipes from this series.
Support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. We hope Patreon can help us get our episodes transcribed for those who need or prefer that, though if you want to help us with transcripts, let us know via email or social media. As the ancient Christians said,
Pax vobiscum.